When a park ranger stumbles upon a frightened little boy and his protective older sister deep in the wilderness, he assumes they're just lost hikers, but as the truth unravels, he realizes they're running from something far worse, with danger closing in. The ranger must act fast to uncover the sinister plot before it's too late. This is a story of survival, courage, and the fight for justice against a powerful criminal network. Before we dive into this story, let us know where you're watching from and if you believe in fighting for what's right. Be sure to like and subscribe for more. The morning air in Crescent Bend National Park was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. The sun had barely begun its ascent, casting elongated shadows across the narrow dirt trails. This far into the wilderness, the sounds of civilization were nothing but a distant memory. The occasional snap of a twig underfoot or the rustle of an unseen animal through the brush were the only disturbances in an otherwise quiet expanse of towering trees and winding creeks. Nathan Reed, a senior park ranger, navigated the familiar terrain with ease. He had spent nearly a decade patrolling these trails, ensuring visitors stayed within designated areas and keeping the peace between man and nature. It was a job that once gave him purpose. Now it felt like an endless cycle of repetition. Most tourists never strayed this far. They kept to the paved scenic loops, snapping photos of the sprawling vistas before retreating to their comfortable lodges. Out here, only the serious hikers or the occasional reckless explorer dared to venture beyond the main trails, and yet something about today felt off. Nathan adjusted the strap of his utility pack, letting his boots crush the damp leaves beneath him. The sun, now creeping higher, had begun its slow conquest of the cool morning air, promising another sweltering afternoon. He sighed, pausing for a moment at a fork in the trail, debating whether to continue his usual route or take the path that led deeper into the forest. This was his life, walking the same trails, seeing the same sights, hearing the same sounds. It was peaceful, sure, but the isolation was starting to gnaw at him. Most of his colleagues were seasonal workers, rotating in and out, leaving him as one of the few constants in this vast, lonely stretch of wilderness. Nathan pushed forward, deciding to follow an older, less traveled path. His instincts told him there was nothing to worry about, but something in the air, an unease that had been creeping in since morning, kept him alert. As he maneuvered past a cluster of fallen logs, something small caught his eye. Half buried beneath a layer of damp earth and decaying leaves was a child's shoe, light blue, with a faded cartoon character barely visible on its side. Nathan knelt down, brushing away the debris. It was too small to belong to any experienced hiker. No adult would let a child this young wander out here alone. He straightened, scanning his surroundings. There were no recent reports of missing persons, at least none that had reached him. Maybe a family had gone off trail and the kid had kicked off their shoe without noticing it. Wasn't unheard of. Still, it didn't sit right with him. He took a photo of the shoe with his work-issued satellite phone, marking the coordinates before moving on. It was probably nothing, but he had learned long ago that small details often led to bigger discoveries. Another half-mile and he heard it, a faint voice carried on the wind. Nathan froze, listening. It was soft, distant, almost like an echo. He turned his head, trying to pinpoint the direction, but as quickly as it had come, it was gone. The silence stretched out, pressing against him. He waited, straining his ears, but all he could hear now was the distant ca of a hawk circling overhead. Maybe it was his mind playing tricks on him. Maybe it had been the wind shifting through the trees, creating the illusion of a voice, but deep down he knew better. Nathan pressed forward, moving with more purpose now. As he rounded a bend, another anomaly revealed itself. A flock of birds suddenly burst from the treetops ahead, their wings flapping wildly as they took off into the sky. Nathan's grip on his radio tightened. Birds didn't just scatter like that without reason. Something or someone had disturbed them. His heart pounded a little faster now, a familiar adrenaline rush creeping in from his search and rescue days. He had spent years responding to lost hikers, injured campers, and panicked families. Most of the time the situation was minor. Someone wandered too far, lost track of time, but there had been cases that turned deadly. He reached the clearing where the birds had erupted. Furman scanned the ground. There was no obvious disturbance, no sign of movement there. forest remained still. Nathan exhaled sharply, running a hand over his beard. Maybe he was overworked, analyzing. He had been on edge for weeks, restless in ways he couldn't explain. Maybe this was just his brain trying to turn a quiet morning into something more, but still, that shoe, that voice, the birds. He shook his head and logged everything into his notebook. If nothing came of it, fine, but if there was even a slight chance that someone needed help, he wasn't going to ignore it. With that thought, he pressed on, his footsteps quieter, more deliberate. Now the sun had fully risen by the time Nathan reached a familiar outpost near the forest's edge. He took a sip from his canteen, letting the water chase away the dryness in his throat. Most of the rangers worked from the main station near the park entrance, but Nathan had always preferred the satellite outposts. Less noise, less small talk, just him, nature, and the occasional visitor who needed directions. He logged his findings into the station's report system, debating whether to flag the shoe as an official concern before he could make a decision. His radio crackled to life. Dispatch, Nathan, you copy? He grabbed the device, pressing the button. Go ahead. Dispatch, visitor reported something strange about 2 miles from your position. Couple of kids wandering off trail, might be lost. Can you check it out? Nathan's pulse kicked up, a child's shrill voice in the wind, birds scattering, and now a report of kids wandering alone in the woods. He didn't hesitate. On my way. As he grabbed his gear and stepped back onto the trail, the unease he had felt all morning solidified into certainty. Something was happening out here, and he was about to find out what. The sound of rushing water blended with the steady rustling of leaves as Nathan made his way toward the stream. He moved with quiet precision, his boots sinking slightly into the damp soil. As he approached the rocky outcrop ahead, something had disturbed the birds earlier, and now, with the faint movement he'd caught just moments ago, he knew he wasn't alone. His hand instinctively rested near his radio, not out of fear but readiness. In his years as a ranger, he had encountered everything from stranded hikers to poachers who weren't keen on being caught. He had learned to expect the unexpected. As he rounded the bend, his steps halted. 2 children, a girl and a much younger boy, were crouched near the water's edge. The girl, no older than 10, sat rigid, her arm wrapped protectively around the boy, whose fingers clung to her shirt with the kind of desperate grip only fear could produce. The boy, maybe 5 years old, was shaking, his small frame curled inward as if trying to make himself smaller. Nathan scanned the area. No backpacks, no supplies, no adults. His gut tightened. This wasn't right. The boy flinched at Nathan's presence, shrinking further into the girl's side. Her posture, already tense, stiffened even more, her eyes darting to the trees behind him as if searching for an escape. Nathan remained still, careful not to startle them further. He had spent enough time handling lost hikers to know that fear could make people do irrational things, but this wasn't just fear. This was survival instinct. Nathan's trained. I took in their condition. They were filthy. Not just from a few hours of wandering, but from what looked like days of exposure. Their clothes were torn, stained with dirt, and traces of dried blood from small scratches that ran along their arms and legs. The boy, Leo, judging by the faint embroidery on his shirt, had a scraped knee and a fresh bruise on his arm. He was shivering despite the warmth of the midday sun. The girl, her blonde hair tangled with leaves and grime, was in slightly better shape, but her hands were scratched raw, likely from pushing through brush or climbing over rough terrain. They had no jackets, no water bottles, nothing to suggest they had set out for a simple hike. Nathan felt the quiet weight of realization settle over him. These kids hadn't just wandered off, they had been running from something. Nathan lowered himself into a crouch, keeping his movements slow, deliberate. Hey there, he said, keeping his voice calm. Even you guys okay? The girl tightened her hold on Leo, her muscles coiling like she was prepared to bolt at any second. Her eyes locked onto his, assessing, calculating. She didn't speak. Leo let out a small whimper and buried his face into her side. Nathan stayed still, allowing them to dictate the next move. He knew pressing too hard would only make them retreat further. I'm a park ranger, he continued, keeping his hands visible. My name's Nathan, you're safe now. Still nothing. The girl's jaw tightened, her expression unreadable, but Nathan recognized the raw determination behind her fear. She wasn't just protecting Leo, she was prepared to fight if necessary. Nathan adjusted his approach. I don't know how you got here, he said carefully, but I can help. A flicker of hesitation crossed her face. It wasn't much, but it was something. The silence stretched between them, the only sound the faint gurgling of the stream. Finally the girl spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Leo, stay behind me. Her protective stance made it clear that she wasn't going to let anyone near him without a fight. Nathan nodded slowly. That's okay, I don't want to take him from you, I just want to make sure you're both all right, she said, nothing her eyes flicking to the trees again. She was expecting someone to appear. Nathan softened his tone further. You have a name. A beat of silence, then cautiously, Emily, and he's Leo. She nodded but offered nothing else. Nathan resisted the urge to press further. She had given him something, and right now that was enough. Now that he had names, the next step was understanding what had happened. His mind ran through the possibility. Scenario 1, they were lost hikers separated from their group. But that didn't fit. There had been no missing child reports from any recent visitors, and their condition suggested they had been on their own for more than just a few hours. Scenario 2, they had run away from home, but that raised more questions than answers. Were their parents? Had someone abandoned them, or was it something worse? Scenario 3, the one his gut told him was right. They were running from someone. Nathan had spent years reading body language, assessing danger, and everything about Emily screamed one thing: she was terrified of being found. He had to tread carefully. If he pushed too hard, she might try to take Leo and disappear deeper into the woods, and if they were running from someone, disappearing could mean real danger. His priority was getting them somewhere safe, somewhere he could get more answers without making them feel trapped. What really happened to Emily and Leo, and where could their parents be? Share your thoughts in the comments. Will Nathan uncover the truth before it's too late? Hit that like button and keep watching to find out. Nathan knew pressing them for details would be pointless. They were too on edge, too guarded. If he wanted any real answers, he had to build trust first. Carefully he reached into his pack and pulled out a granola bar and a bottle of water. Without a word he set them on the ground between him and the children, making no move to hand them over. Leo's eyes flickered to the water. Immediately he hesitated, looking at Emily for approval. She didn't say anything, but after a moment he snatched up the bottle and twisted the cap off with trembling fingers. He drank too fast, coughing on the first few gulps, but he didn't stop. Emily waited longer. She kept her gaze locked on Nathan, searching for any sign that he might be a threat. After several long beats, she finally grabbed the granola bar, not for herself, but for Leo. She unwrapped it and pressed it into his small hands. Nathan didn't react, pretending not to notice. He had dealt with enough scared people in crisis to know that any sign of acknowledgement might make her second-guess her decision. Instead, he remained still, watching the way Emily's grip on Leon never wavered. She wasn't just taking care of him, Once Leo finished the granola bar, Nathan leaned forward a little and said, "We should go to the ranger station," keeping his voice calm. "It's safe there and we can figure things out." Emily's whole body tensed up. "No." Nathan blinked, surprised by her quick refusal. "It's not far," he reassured her. "You can rest, get cleaned up, and no one will bother you." Emily shook her head and said, "We can't," with more conviction this time. Her tone showed fear, not mistrust. Nathan looked at her carefully, glancing over her shoulder, scanning the trees as if she expected someone to emergency from the shadows. Nathan followed her gaze, but the woods remained still. "Emily," he said carefully, "nobody can hurt you there." She didn't look convinced. That set off alarms in his head. If she had been lost, she'd be relieved. If her parents had simply gotten separated from them, she'd want to go somewhere safe to wait for them. But this was active resistance. Someone was still out there. Nathan kept his voice steady. As he reached for his radio, he had to approach this carefully. The wrong move might send Emily running into the forest with Leo, and in their condition they wouldn't last much longer out here. He pressed the button, speaking evenly, "This is Ranger Reed. I found 2 unaccompanied minors, Emily 10 years old and Leo 5. They're in rough shape, but not injured beyond minor scrapes." The response came almost instantly. "Copy that, Ranger Reed. Stand by." Nathan waited, keeping his focus on Emily and Leo. Emily stared at the radio like it was a weapon. A moment later, headquarters came back. "No reports of." Nathan frowned and asked, "Are you sure?" "There were 2 young kids who couldn't have been out here alone for long." "There were no reports from guests," calls from locals, or anything in neighboring jurisdictions. Nathan breathed out through his nose and said, "That's not right. Someone should have reported them missing. 2 kids this young? It wasn't an accident they were left out here." He looked at Emily again and couldn't read her face, but she had tightened her grip on Leo's arm. She had heard him. What dispatch said, and it scared her. Nathan lowered the radio slowly, keeping his body language as non-threatening as possible. "I'm going to have to contact the police," he said, keeping his voice gentle. "They'll need to." Emily flinched so hard that Leo whimpered in response. Nathan stopped mid-sentence, her hands curled into fists, her entire frame going rigid. Leo instinctively shrunk behind her, as if the mere mention of law enforcement had put them both in immediate danger. Nathan held up a hand. "Hey. It's okay, you don't have to talk to anyone if you don't want to." Emily's jaw clenched, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Nathan leaned forward slightly, softening his tone even more. "But I promise, I just want to help." Emily didn't answer, but after a long agonizing silence she nodded. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Nathan knew without a doubt that these kids weren't just lost, they were hiding, and whoever they were running from was still out there. The forest was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves underfoot and the distant hum of insects. In the brush, Nathan led Emily and Leo along the narrow trail, keeping his pace slow enough for them to follow without feeling rushed. His vehicle wasn't far, just another 10 minutes along this radial, but every instinct told him that something about this situation wasn't right. Then in the distance an engine revved. It was faint at first, a low mechanical growl against the backdrop of the woods, but as it grew closer Leo froze mid-step. His entire body went rigid, and he squeezed Emily's hand so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His breathing turned shallow, his chest rising and falling too quickly. Nathan immediately picked up on it. A normal lost child would be relieved to hear an approaching vehicle. Help usually meant safety, but Leo was terrified. Nathan crouched to his level, keeping his voice soft. "Leo, what's wrong? You're safe now." The boy shook his head violently, his little shoulders trembling. No, his voice cracked, panic rising in his throat. "We have to hide. He'll find us." Nathan felt the weight of those words settle heavily in his chest. "He'll find us." That wasn't the fear of a child who had simply wandered too far. That was a hunted fear that came from knowing someone dangerous was looking for you. Nathan's eyes flicked up to Emily, watching her closely. She wasn't panicking like Leo was, but she was watching him carefully, her mind working behind her guarded expression. She knew exactly what Leo was afraid of, and she wasn't going to tell Nathan. Nathan rose to his feet and turned his attention to Emily. If Leo was too scared to explain, she was the only one who could. "Emily," he said carefully, keeping his tone measured, "whose car are you afraid of?" Emily's shoulders squared, her expression neutral, but he could see the tension in the way she held herself. "Is it someone dangerous?" he pressed, and her eyes darted around, scanning the trees as if calculating the best way to answer. Then she exhaled sharply and shook her head. "It's nothing, he's just scared of the dark. We got lost on a hike, that's all." Nathan steadied her. Her voice was too tight, her lie too forced. Earlier she had refused to say where they came from. Now she was subtly claiming they were hiking. He didn't call her out on it, not yet, but now he was certain she was hiding something. Nathan let the silence stretch between them as he took a closer look at their condition. Emily's shirt had small tears along the sleeve, not from random wear and tear, but as if someone had grabbed her by the arm. Leo's pants were ripped at the knees, not just from running but from crawling through rough terrain. Their shoes were caked in dried mud, suggesting they had been traveling for more than a day. Nathan exhaled slowly. If they had simply gotten lost, the lodge would have reported them missing by now, but there were no reports of missing children, and that meant something was being covered up. Nathan stopped walking. Emily took another step forward before realizing he had halted. She turned, her eyes flashing with something close to irritation. "What?" she asked. Nathan didn't answer right away. He let a few beats pass, letting the weight of the silence press. And then he spoke, his tone firm but calm. "Emily, I need you to be honest with me." Her jaw tightened. "Did someone leave you out here on purpose?" She didn't answer, and her posture stiffened. Nathan gently pressed, "I can't help if I don't know what's going on." There was still silence. The only sounds were the faint rustling of leaves and the distant chirping of birds. Emily looked down, but she didn't speak. Finally, her voice crackled into a whisper. Mom said she'd come back for us. Nathan's stomach dropped. Emily wasn't saying they were lost, she was. Left behind. Leo clung to her harder, burying his face into her arm, his little body curling inward as if to make himself disappear. Nathan felt a cold, heavy realization settle over him. This wasn't just a case of kids getting lost in the woods, this was something much worse, and whoever had left them out here was still out there. Nathan led Emily and Leo toward his ranger vehicle parked just beyond the tree line the track had been. Slow, their exhaustion evident in every step by the time they reached the truck. Leo's legs were barely. Nathan opened the back and took out a couple of emergency blankets. He wrapped one around Emily's shoulders and then gently wrapped the other around Leo, who curled up in the seat without protesting. "You're safe here," Nathan said, putting a bottle of water and a protein bar on the bench next to them. "Eat and rest." Leo didn't need convincing. He reached for the water right away and took a long sip, his hands still shaking. Emily, on the other hand, stayed stiff and her eyes locked on the. Nathan knelt next to the open door and waited. He didn't push or ask questions, he just let the silence settle, knowing that if she was going to talk, it had to be on her terms. Emily let out a sharp breath, her fingers gripping the blanket so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her body sagged from the weight of everything pressing down on her, and tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away, refusing to let them fall. Her voice was barely above a whisper, and we hadn't lost a breath. "Then we ran away." Nathan's jaw tightened. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed sent a fresh wave of concern through him. He kept his tone calm even from what Emily swallowed hard, staring at the ground, and then finally she told him everything. Emily's voice was measured, but there was a rawness to it, like she was reliving every terrifying moment as she spoke. She explained that their family, David and Claire Montgomery, had been staying at a luxury lodge resort near the park. It had been a vacation, something their parents had planned months in advance. Then 3 nights ago, everything changed. Emily's hands curled into fists as she recounted the attack. "They came in the middle of the night," she whispered. "I woke up to." She hesitated, then shook her head, trying to push the memory back. "I heard my mom scream, and then nothing." Nathan's stomach tightened. "Masked men?" he asked. Emily nodded. 4 of them, maybe more. They were fast, organized." Nathan didn't interrupt. He let her continue, piecing together the timeline in his head as she spoke. "The first thing they did was take Mom and Dad," Emily said. "They didn't even see me at first. I was in the other room with Leo." Nathan glanced at Leo, who was staring blankly at his lap. He wasn't crying, but he looked hollow, his small hands gripping the blanket like a lifeline. Emily's voice dropped lower. "Then one of them came back," she said. "I heard him in the hallway. His boots were heavy. I didn't know what to do. I just froze." Nathan's hands curled into fists. He could picture the scene perfectly. A little girl standing in the dark listening as a stranger came closer. Knowing what was coming next, one of them grabbed Leo. She continued. "He screamed, and I just reacted." Her jaw clenched. "I kicked him as hard as I could. He wasn't expecting it, I guess, because he dropped." Leo the first grabbed him and ran. Nathan exhaled, impressed. Most kids would have panicked, would have shut down entirely, but Emily, she had fought back. "You got out of the lodge?" Nathan prompted. "Then what? We ran into the woods," Emily said. "I didn't know where we were going. I just ran. We hid all night. I kept thinking they'd come looking for us, but they didn't." Nathan frowned. "You never saw them again?" Emily shook her head. "No, I thought I heard something once, maybe a car, but I didn't stop. I didn't trust anyone." Her arms tightened around Leo. "The first thought, maybe Mom and Dad would escape too. Maybe they'd find us." She took a shaky breath, but they never did. Leo's voice was small. "They took Mom and Dad." Nathan felt a cold weight settle in his chest. This wasn't just a case of missing parents, this was a kidnapping, and it had been deliberate. Nathan rubbed a hand down his face, processing the details. The Montgomery weren't just an ordinary family. David and Claire Montgomery owned one of the largest logistics companies in the country. They were worth millions. "Emily," Nathan said carefully, "did they say anything about why they took your parents?" Emily nodded, her expression darkening. "At first I thought it was just for ransom, but I heard them talking. They were saying things like," she swallowed, her voice unsteady, "we can't let them go, and this isn't just about money." Nathan's pulse quickened. "That changed things. Kidnappings for Ransom followed a pattern: quick demand, quick payoff, but if there was no ransom call, if there were other motives in play, it meant something much more dangerous was happening. Emily's voice dropped to a whisper. They said. She hesitated, then forced it out. If they don't cooperate, we get rid of them. Nathan's blood ran cold. These weren't common criminals. This wasn't a random attack the Montgomery were just being held. They were on borrowed time. Nathan ran through the facts quickly. The kidnappers were professionals. They had planned this. The fact that they didn't come looking for Emily and Leo meant that either they didn't know the kids had escaped or they didn't care. If they didn't care, that meant the parents were the real targets. Nathan had to act quickly. He told Emily, "You did the right thing by running and saving your brother." Emily blinked hard and lowered her head. She wasn't crying yet, but she looked like she wanted to. Nathan stood up and took his radio from his belt. "I need to talk to you," he told her. "I need to get the police involved." This time, Emily didn't prod, she just nodded. Nathan stood next to his Ranger truck and gripped the radio tighter than necessary as he told park headquarters what was going on. His voice stayed steady, but his mind was already racing with ideas for what to do next. "This is Ranger Reed. I need you to report the 2 minors in my custody. Their parents, David and Claire Montgomery, were taken 3 nights ago from a private lodge near the park." Confirmed abduction. A pause, then static crackled through the speaker before dispatch responded. "Copy that, Ranger. Stand by." Nathan turned toward the kids, his eyes settling on Emily. She was curled up in the back seat of his truck with Leo tucked under her arm. She looked smaller now, the weight of what she had just admitted pressing down on her. "You did the right thing telling me," Nathan said, keeping his voice calm. "We'll find them." Emily didn't respond, but her fingers tightened slightly around the blanket draped over her shoulders. It wasn't not quite trust yet, but it was getting there. The radio crackled again, and Ranger Reed was told that the Montgomery family had been reported missing 3 days ago by their estate manager. The local authorities thought they had gone offline on their own, but no ransom demand had been made. Nathan's stomach dropped. No ransom demand meant one of 2 things: either the kidnappers were planning something much worse, or the Montgomery family had already been disposed of. He looked back at Emily and Leo and wondered what would have happened if they had been taken along with their parents. To them, Nathan didn't want to dwell on that thought. Instead, he pressed the radio again. "I need this case escalated immediately. The kids are safe, but the parents are still missing, and we have reason to believe they're in serious danger." "Understood. We'll notify state authorities." Nathan let out a slow breath, but it didn't make him feel any better. This was bigger than he had anticipated, and he had a sinking feeling they were already running out of time with law enforcement notified. Nathan turned his focus back to Emily. He needed every piece of information she could give him, anything that could point them in the right direction. "Emily," he said, carefully crouching next to the truck, "do you remember anything else about the men who took your parents? Anything at all?" Emily bit her lip, thinking. Nathan waited, watching as she forced herself to push past her fear, searching for details buried under the trauma. After a few moments, she nodded. "The van they put Mom and Dad in, it had a weird plate. I don't remember the whole thing, but the last part was 4XJ." Nathan quickly scribbled that down in his notebook. "Good, that's really helpful. Anything else?" Emily hesitated, then took a slow breath. "One of them had a tattoo." Nathan's head tilted slightly. "Can you describe it?" Emily nodded. "It was on his forearm, a snake wrapped around a dagger." Nathan wrote that down immediately. A unique tattoo like that could lead to an ID if the police had records on known criminals. Emily shifted uncomfortably, but her gaze remained steady, and they kept talking about something. "I didn't understand everything, but I remember one of them saying we have to get them to the drop-off point before it's too late." Nathan felt a chill creep down his spine. "Drop-off point? That wasn't the kind of phrase kidnappers used when planning a simple ransom demand. That was the kind of phrase traffickers used." Nathan nodded, forcing his expression to remain neutral, though his stomach was twisting. "You did great, Emily. That's all really useful." Emily just hugged Leo tighter, her lips pressed into a thin line. Nathan stepped back, flipping his notebook shut. They had leads now. They needed to act. Nathan had been in enough search and rescue operations to know how these cases usually played out. Time was the enemy. The longer a kidnapping case went unsolved, the lower the chances of recovery. He relayed the new information to dispatch, who promised to escalate the case within minutes. As radio crackled again, Ranger read, "The case has been referred to the FBI. Agents will be in contact with you soon." That should have reassured him. It didn't. FBI involvement was good, but Nathan knew how bureaucracy worked. This wouldn't be their only case. It would take time for them to gather resources, time to process leads, time to coordinate, and time was the one thing the Montgomery didn't have. Nathan's grip tightened around the radio. "Do they have an ETA?" A pause. "They're still assessing the situation." Nathan exhaled sharply. He knew exactly what that meant. The FBI was waiting for more concrete intel before fully committing resources to them. It was still an open-ended case, not yet a crisis. He made his decision. Nathan shut the radio off and turned back to Emily. "You said they mentioned a drop-off point." He said. Emily nodded slowly. Nathan pulled out a detailed park map, spreading it across the truck. Said, "There are a lot of access roads leading in and out of the park." He muttered, "If they needed a place to transport people without being seen, they'd use one of these isolated routes." Emily leaned forward, scanning the map with him. "This one," she said, pointing at a remote service road that cut through the forest leading out toward an old warehouse district near the outskirts of town. Nathan followed their path with his finger, his mind already working. If this was their intended route, then it was possible the Montgomery had already been moved. But if they hadn't, if there was even a small chance they were still somewhere near the park, then Nathan needed to act now. He turned to Emily. "The FBI will take over the investigation soon, but I'm not going to sit around and wait." Emily's brows furrowed. "What do you mean?" Nathan shut the map. "I'm going to find them." Emily looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. Leo, still half buried in his blanket, whispered, "Please don't let them take Mom and Dad away." Nathan knelt down, meeting Leo's tired, frightened gaze. "I won't," he promised. Then he stood, grabbed his keys, and made a call of his own. It was time to track these guys down. Nathan barely had time to catch his breath before he was back on the phone with law enforcement. He relayed the partial license plate number Emily remembered from the van, hoping it would lead to something concrete. It didn't take long. Within an hour, an officer from the State Police Auto Theft Division called back. "We ran the plate fragment G gave us. We've got a match on a stolen vehicle. Black utility van reported missing 2 weeks ago from a warehouse in San Antonio." Nathan's grip tightened around his phone. "Where is it now?" "Recovered last night, found abandoned in an industrial lot outside the city." Nathan exchanged a look with the FBI agent who had just arrived at the ranger station to oversee the case. "Was it processed?" "Yes." "No prints, no registration, wiped clean, but the forensics team found fabric strands near the back, small fibers matching their description of clothing." "The Montgomery." Nathan breathed out, confirming that Montgomery had been in that van. "We need to see security footage from that area," and he said he would work on it in an hour. The call ended, and Nathan turned to the FBI agent and said, "We've got movement." The footage came in faster than expected. The industrial lot had 2 surveillance cameras on nearby buildings. One was partially obscured, but the other caught a clear shot of the van pulling into the lot just before midnight. Nathan watched the grainy footage closely on a screen inside the ranger station. Standing shoulder to shoulder with the FBI agents, a group of masked men emerged from the van. 2 of them dragged unconscious figures from the back, one taller, one shorter. Nathan clenched his jaw. "David and Claire." A few minutes later, a dark-colored SUV pulled up beside them. The video wasn't clear enough to make out the license plate, but it did show one crucial detail. One of the masked men had a tattoo running down his forearm, a snake wrapped around a dagger. Emily's description was dead on. The FBI wasted no time. They ran facial recognition software on the exposed portions of the men's faces and came back with a hit. Miguel Rowe is a known enforcer for the Los Sombras-backed trafficking syndicate operating across Texas. Nathan felt the weight of that name. This wasn't just a random group of criminals looking for a quick ransom payout. This was something bigger. The FBI briefed Nathan on what they knew about Rowe's operation. They specialized in high-profile ransom kidnappings, the lead agent explained, but ransom is only one Part of their business, Nathan crossed his arms, and the other part the agent's expression hardened. Human trafficking. A chill ran down Nathan's spine. Some of their victims never make it back, the agent continued. If a ransom isn't paid fast enough or if the targets are too much of a liability, they disappear. Nathan's jaw clenched. You mean they killed? The agent didn't blink. Yes. Nathan turned toward Emily, who was sitting with Leo in the adjacent office, unaware of the conversation happening just outside the door. They mentioned The agent nodded and said, "We're working on it. If we can figure out where they are before they move them again, we might be able to get the Montgomery back alive." Nathan breathed out and rubbed his hands together. The clock was ticking. What Nathan didn't know, what none of them knew yet, was that within hours of the FBI getting involved, information had been leaked that the kidnappers knew Emily and Leo were still alive, which meant they were still planning an exchange. Had a problem. The Montgomery weren't their only concern anymore. Now they needed to eliminate the only witnesses who could identify them. That decision was made fast, but by early afternoon an unmarked black sedan pulled into the local police substation where the FBI had temporarily placed Emily and Leo for protective custody. A man in a suit stepped out. He had the calm confidence of someone who belonged. He walked straight into the building, flashing a badge to the desk officer. "I'm here for the Montgomery children," he said smoothly. "We're transferring them to a federal safe house." The officer nodded. The request made sense. The FBI had already placed Emily and Leo under their protection, but there was just one problem. Nathan had been watching from across the station. Something about the man was off. Nathan watched the exchange carefully from a distance, noting small inconsistencies that didn't add up. The badge number on the agent's ID, it didn't match any federal credentials Nathan had seen before. The uniform was slightly off. The wrong stitching pattern on the jacket, and most importantly, the FBI had already confirmed their protective detail was staying put. This man wasn't here to protect Emily and Leo, he was here to eliminate them. Nathan stepped forward, voice sharp. "Hold on." The man turned, masking his surprise quickly. Nathan narrowed his eyes. "Which division are you with?" The man barely hesitated. "Human Trafficking Task Force." Nathan crossed his arms. "Funny, because the actual task force agent in charge of this case is right behind me." The man's expression flickered in an instant. He lunged for Emily. Nathan moved first. He intercepted the man, grabbing his wrist before he could reach for his weapon. A struggle ensued, quick, sharp movements until Nathan disarmed him and forced him to the ground. Within seconds, FBI agents swarmed the room, securing the imposter. Nathan took a step back, breathing hard. He turned toward Emily and Leo. Emily was pale, gripping Leo so tightly he looked like he could barely breathe. Leo just stared wide-eyed. "It's over," Nathan reassured them, but it wasn't. Not yet. After the suspect was taken into custody, the truth came out fast. The man wasn't just an enforcer, he was sent to kill Emily and Leo. "They knew you were alive," Nathan told Emily later that night, "and they were going to make sure you never talked." She didn't say anything, she just sat there holding Leo's hand, staring at the wall. Nathan knelt beside her. "They won't stop," he said, "not unless we stop them first." Emily finally looked at him, determined. Nathan exhaled, and instead he turned to the FBI. "We need to move faster," he said, "because if we don't." He didn't finish the sentence, and he didn't have to. They all knew exactly what was at stake. Nathan stood in the FBI mobile command unit, his eyes fixed on the screen displaying a live aerial feed of the warehouse by the docks. A cluster of FBI agents and tactical officers surrounded him, poring over surveillance reports and blueprint layouts of the target location. The tension in the room was thick. They had less than 12 hours before the Montgomery disappeared forever. "What of the agents?" A tall woman with the short cropped hair pointed to the screen. "We got confirmation from the enforcer. We arrested. The shipment is set for tonight at midnight. This location matches intel from other kidnappings linked to Los Sombras. If the Montgomery are still alive, they'll be inside." Nathan studied the grainy thermal imaging footage. 2 heat signatures inside the warehouse matched adult-sized bodies, both seated, barely moving. "That's them," he said. Another agent pacing near the monitors added, "Perimeter security is tight, at least a dozen armed guards, heavy firepower. This won't be a simple breach." Nathan exhaled sharply, glancing at the time, 8:45 p.m. If they didn't act now, the Montgomery could be on a cargo ship or buried in a shallow grave by morning. The lead FBI agent turned to the group. We go in hard and fast, multiple entry points, coordinated assault. No one gets out unless we say so. Nathan clenched his jaw. This was it. Nathan adjusted the bulletproof vest strapped tightly over his chest, the weight heavier than he expected. A tactical earpiece buzzed in his ear, linking him to the command team. Technically, he had no jurisdiction here. He wasn't an FBI agent, nor was he part of any tactical unit, but his connection to the kids and his insistence on seeing this through had earned him a place on the team. One of the team leaders, a rugged man named Morales, clapped him on the shoulder. Stay close, follow orders, and don't try to be a hero. Nathan gave a curt nod. He wasn't here to play hero, he was here to bring Emily and Leo's parents home. 10:55 p.m. The tactical teams moved into position surrounding the warehouse from multiple entry points. Snipers took positions on nearby rooftops, their scopes trained on barbaritations. Outside the facility, Nathan's heartbeat pounded in his ears. They had one shot at this. 11:03 p.m. Breach. A single flashbang exploded near the main entrance, sending the warehouse into chaos. Tactical teams breached from three sides, shouting orders as gunfire erupted from the kidnappers. Nathan stayed low, moving with his unit toward the rear rooms. His earpiece crackled with updates. North team engaging targets. Second floor secured, warehouse clear except the back rooms. Nathan's grip tightened on his sidearm as he pushed forward. This was where they were holding the Montgomery. Nathan reached the reinforced steel door at the end of the corridor. His pulse was hammering. This was it. He stepped back and drove his boot into the door. It barely budged. Again harder. The door burst inward. Inside, David and Claire Montgomery were slumped in chairs, hands and feet bound with zip ties, duct tape. They had bloody cuts and bruises on their faces and clothes, but they were still alive when Nathan rushed forward and saw a dark blur move out of the shadows. It was one of the kidnappers lunging at Nathan with a knife. Nathan barely had time to react before the blade cut him, skimming off the side of his vest. His training paid off as he grabbed the man's wrist and punched him hard, knocking him back. Nathan quickly recovered and hit the kidnapper in the jaw with an elbow, sending him tumbling. Seized the opening and drove him into the wall, pinning him with all his strength. The fight ended with one last bone-snapping punch. Nathan stood over the unconscious man, breathing heavily. He turned back to David and Claire, grabbing his knife and slicing through the zip ties. David blinked at him, dazed. To Nathan, read your kids are safe. Claire let out a choke sob, and then outside, more gunfire. Nathan pulled David and Claire to their feet. We have to move now. Nathan guided the Montgomery through the darkened corridors, moving quickly but carefully. Gunfire cracked from the loading dock. Another flashbang exploded, casting brief flashes of white light through the warehouse as they neared the exit. FBI agents stormed in from the opposite direction. All clear. One of them, called Los Sombras, had been neutralized, half of them dead, the rest in custody. The organization had suffered a devastating blow. Nathan let out a slow breath. It was over. The Montgomery were rushed to a secure facility for medical evaluation. Nathan followed, wanting to make sure the kids saw their parents as soon as possible. As soon as Emily and Leo were brought into the room, everything stopped for a brief second. Emily just stood there, then her eyes filled with tears, and she ran straight into her mother's arms. Leo followed right after, burying his face against David's chest. Cla sobbed as she held them close, whispering something over and over. Nathan didn't move. He just watched. David's voice cracked. We thought we'd never see you again. Emily, through her tears, clutched his jacket. We never gave up. Nathan felt something deep in his chest shift. This was why he had fought so hard for this moment. He stepped back, quietly slipping out of the room as the family held each other for the first time in days. They were whole again. The days following the warehouse raid were a whirlwind of arrests, interrogations, and evidence gathering. The lumber syndicate had taken a severe blow, their ringleaders in custody, their trafficking routes exposed, their network crumbling. Nathan stood outside the FBI field office as black SUVs and prisoner train transport bands pulled away, taking the captured criminals into federal custody. These guys are done. One of the FBI agents, Morris, muttered beside him. We nailed them to the wall. Between the evidence we pulled from the warehouse and the testimony we have lined up, they won't be seeing daylight again. Nathan nodded. But the operation had uncovered a web of criminal activity stretching far beyond the Montgomery case. The raid had led authorities to multiple safe house financial accounts and laundering frauds, effectively dismantling their syndicate's entire regional operation. But what mattered most to Nathan was that David and Claire Montgomery were safe inside the field office. David and CLA sat across from FBI investigators going over their statements. Though still physically weakened, they spoke firmly, determined to see justice served. "Will testify," David said. His voice was hoarse but steady. "These people, what they do can't continue." Claire nodded in agreement. "We lost everything for those 3 days. We thought we'd never see our children again." She swallowed hard, glancing toward the adjacent waiting room where Emily and Leo sat waiting for their parents to finish. The lead FBI investigator, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes, leaned forward. "Your testimony will be key," she said. "With your first-hand accounts and the physical evidence we recovered, we'll be able to lock them away for good." Nathan listened from the doorway, arms crossed. He had seen enough of these cases to know that without solid witness testimony, criminals like these often found loopholes to escape conviction. But this time the Montgomery were standing firm. "Good," Nathan said, stepping into the room. "Let's make sure they don't get another chance." David turned toward him, his expression softening. "We wouldn't be here if it weren't for you." Nathan shook his head. "You wouldn't be here if Emily hadn't fought like hell to save her brother. You've got a strong kid." Claire's eyes glistened. "We know." From the waiting room, Emily peered through the doorway, her gaze locked on Nathan. He knew it was coming. Goodbyes. The Montgomery were preparing to relocate to an undisclosed location for their safety. With Los Sombras still operating in other territories, the FBI recommended protective measures, but Emily and Leo refused to leave without seeing Nathan one last time. They ran to him, nearly knocking him back with the force of their hugs. Nathan froze for a second, then slowly rested a hand on each of their backs. Emily clutched his jacket. "You promise she won't forget us?" Nathan crouched down so he was eye level with her. "I could never forget you." Leo clutched his hand, looking up at him. "You say this?" Nathan swallowed. He wasn't used to moments like these, raw, honest, and full of emotion. He could handle life or death situations, could face down armed men without blinking up, but this was different. "I'll always remember you," he told them, "and if you ever need me, I'll be there." Emily wiped at her eyes before reaching into her backpack. "I made something," she said, pulling out a folded piece of paper. Nathan took it, unfolding it carefully. It was a hand-drawn card, a crayon picture of Nathan in his ranger uniform standing tall between Emily and Leo. Above them, a bright sun shined in a deep blue sky. At the top, in bold, uneven handwriting, were 2 words: "Our hero." Nathan gripped the paper tightly, his throat suddenly dry. I don't know what to say," he admitted. Emily smiled through her tears. "You don't have to say anything." Leo's small fingers curled around Nathan's wrist. Nathan nodded, voice low. "Take care of each other." "All right." Emily nodded. "We will." With one last squeeze of his hand, they turned and walked back to their parents. Nathan watched them go, still gripping the drawing like it was the most valuable thing in the world. The next morning, Nathan returned to the national park. The world moved on as it always did. The trees stood tall, the wind whispered through the branches, and the sky stretched endlessly above him. He walked along one of the familiar trails, his boots pressing into the damp earth. For years, this place had felt like a prison of routine, a cycle of patrols, paperwork, and solitude, but now it felt different. It felt like a place where something truly important had happened. He reached a scenic overlook where the land stretched out in all directions, miles of untouched beauty. For a long moment, he just stood there, taking it all in. Then slowly, he reached into his pocket. He pulled out Emily and Leo's drawing, running his fingers over the crayon lines, over the words they had written. He smiled, not just because of what he had done, but because of what they had given him in return. Nathan exhaled, feeling lighter than he had in years. Softly, almost to himself, he murmured, "Yeah, I made a difference." The wind carried his words away, but he knew they were true. Thanks for watching till the end. If you enjoyed this story, give this video a like if you haven't already, and subscribe for more.